Hey friends, and welcome to another episode of JavaScript Tip. In this episode, we'll cover loops. What we first need to understand with a for loop, a simple for loop, is that it has three different parts to it. The first part is where we would create any kind of variable that we say this is the starting variable, this is the value that I am to track. Then I have some kind of breaking condition that if this one evaluates false, the for loop would stop running. Now, thirdly, you have the incremental phase. In this phase, we would increment the loop. So, for example, if we were to increment by 1 and have 10 items in a array, then it would run 10 times. But if we increment it by 2, it would only run half as many times because we have increased the level of incrementation. Now, let's look at a more tangible example, some real code. This is just a syntax. Here we have a for loop. Our starting condition is our position variable that's being set to 0, so we're going to start on 0. That's a very common thing to do, so you should definitely start your variables at 0. This is the evaluation of the break condition. What we're saying here is as long as position is under cart length, then keep going. Now, when it's equal to cart length, then break this for loop. And here we can see that we do position plus plus, which means we increment by 1. Should we want to increment twice as fast, we could just increment by 2 instead. Let's take that back. Right. What we can also see as part of our for loop here on line 18 is that we do a console log. What we aim to do is to print out what's going on. So this is our first case of just displaying whatever is in the cart. We can see that our cart is an array. It has 3 items. Each item has a name property, CD, DVD, and a cassette. So you can tell that I am, I'm not young anymore, let's say that. So cart, position, and we try to print every single name. So let's do that in a terminal. Terminal is a bit big. And now we are running Node with loops. Now you can see that it's printing out CD, DVD, and cassette. So our display use case is definitely being used. Now, a little gotcha here is that I'm using let instead of var. And why is that? Well, if I were to use var, something very interesting would happen. Let's try to rerun this code just by printing this. And you can see that position is still alive as a variable. In many other languages than JavaScript, this would not be the case. Were I to define a variable within a for loop, it would stop to exist in many other languages. That is not the case if you're using the var keyword. And this has to do with the fact that with var, there is function scope, but there is no block scope. And this for loop construct here is a block. And the only way to get block scope is to instead use the let keyword. Let's switch it up a bit. Now we're looking at an object. Now an object in this case, it has 2 different properties, name and city. We can use the in operator to loop through the object. So let's try to run that next. And it's telling us not the value so much. If you wanted Chris and London from this is not the way to do it. What this one does is that it iterates over all the properties on the object. So this is giving us name and city. You might be used from using an in keyword from other languages. So this is a bit of a gotcha that this is actually giving you the key and not the value, if you think that an object is consisting of keys and values. Let's look at this example, why this might be a tad problematic. In this case, we have an array of numbers, 1, 2, 3, and we're using the in keyword. Now, you might want 1, 2, 3. What you're getting is 0, 1, and 2, which is, again, the keys. Because if you look at an array, what's really going on within an array is that it's kind of looks like so. So if you know that this is what the inner construct looks like of an array, then all of this makes sense. This is just a parenthesis. But yeah, so just know that the in keyword is really trying to iterate over your keys rather than your values. Another way to do this, if you're not using a for loop, is using Object.keys. So we can log that out. So that's a very handy little method. So now we're getting 0, 1, and 2. We could also do values if that's what we wanted. and then we would get 1, 2, 3. So why is all of this happening to us? I didn't explain that well, I think. If we do type of array, you'd kind of guess that you would get an array, right? Looking at the type. And this is the thing with JavaScript, it's very object-centric. So here you can see that it's actually telling us that an array is an object, so that's the internal implementation. So that's why Object.values and Object.keys would work on an array. Now, one thing that modern JavaScript has provided us with is the of operator. So if we were to use that on the array instead, we would get what we think we want. So here we're getting 1, 2, 3 because of is, instead of listing out the keys, it's giving us the values. So remember the of if you try to actually iterate over the values rather than the keys. Now we're looking at an array, again 1, 2, 3, and in this case we are doing a forEach loop. Now the forEach loop has the ability to take a few things. We are hovering over this so you can see the full prototype of what it takes. What we're looking at here is a callback function that first has the value itself, then the index, and lastly the array itself. So depending on what you want to do, if you just want to iterate over the item, then you would take this one and display that. If you're interested in knowing exactly what index it's on, you would have display number in that case. And if you want to know something about the array, it's the third argument as part of this function. So let's run that, and we can see that we get 1, 2, 3 out. So forEach is something that you could be using. Now the reason why you shouldn't use forEach is if you want to have the ability to break in the loop. So if you use a ordinary for loop, it's perfectly fine to use keywords such as break and continue. Were you to use forEach, you don't have a good way to stop your iteration. Now let's switch to another case. This time let's talk about map. So now we've gone from iteration to map, and with map we aim to change something. So here we have a list of heroes. We have Sina the warrior princess, of course, and we have Alexander the Great. What we aim to do is by using map, we just want to say, hey, I want one or a few properties from that object, or I want to change it somehow. So in this case, despite the fact that I'm looping through heroes objects that has 2 different properties, I choose to only return the name. And this is what mapping allows you to do. It allows you to create something new that wasn't there before. So in this case, I'm just picking the part that is of interest to me, which is the name, and running through this forEach, then I would get the names back. And we can see then that we're getting Xena or Alexander the Great. Now, if I wanted to change that, I can just take country instead, if country is what I want to loop through. So this is quite flexible. All you need to do inside of this function here is to define what values per object do I want to display instead. So map gives you that chance to change things. Let's talk about our third use case, that of reduction. As I said initially, reduction is about taking a lot of something and reduce it down to less of something. So in this case, we have a list of integers, 1, 2, 3, 4. Reduce, what it does is that it operates on your previous value and your current value. Now, depending on how you specify your previous value, or rather what goes on in here, your previous could be an accumulated sum. So what's going on here is we define what should happen to each and every value. So we're saying the previous value should be added to the current value, and thereby for every iteration of this loop, you would end up with a value that keeps on growing because you are kind of reducing it. Let's do a console log so you see what the sum looks like. Now we end up with 10. Very good way to understand exactly what's going on is to do this. So we want to return that, but that doesn't really stop us from doing a console log in the middle of this looping, because a looping is what's going on. So we want to loop previous and we want to loop current. So the whole point of what I'm doing right now is so that you can see how it develops for every iteration. So first off, By the way, this 0 here means that this is the starting value of our sum. So what's going on is that in the first case, previous is going to be 0, doesn't have a value. Our current is going to be the first value here, which is 1. And we can see that as part of this. So previous is 0, current is 1. Because of the way we do things, previous will be 0 plus 1. So next time around, previous will have the value 1, current will have the value 2, and so on and so forth. So if you ever wonder what goes on inside of a reduce, it's a good idea to console log out these two values, so you see how things progressively build up. But yeah, so this is us taking the long route. If you understand what this one does, you can just go back to our first statement here where we did like so. Let's see here, was this it? Right. So yeah, definitely use reduce if you feel that like you have a use case where you have many values and you want that to turn into one value. This may look like it only works on integers, right? But you can definitely use this as part of an object as well. So let's show that. So here you have an object, or rather two objects. In one object you have an object with a property name. The other object has property country. Now the objective that we are trying to fulfill here is to make sure that we merge these two objects. So what we're after is an object containing all of these properties without getting many objects. So we're still interested in taking this list of your object and get that into one object. So what we're doing is to try to reduce all of these objects and create one massive object. So we use this ... operator with the previous values, and this is a way to spread them. And then we do the same thing for the current values, and we end up with what? We're not actually printing this value, so let's do that. So now we're ending up with this reduced object that came from two different objects. So now we get name and country, and this all thanks to reduce. So as you can see, reduce is really useful for both numbers as well as objects. So definitely have a look at all of these use cases, everything from looping and iteration to the map, and finally now using reduce. That was all, folks. If you like this kind of video, if you want me to make more videos like this, definitely a thumbs up and consider subscribing. Thank you for listening.